Hey everybody, welcome to Commercial Construction Elevate the Industry. I'm your host, Dave Presida. We are in season 3, so you all know why we're here. I'm excited today to have a good friend and a longtime associate named Bill Simpson. He is the CEO of Open Door America. It's a 501c3. We'll talk about all that. And you might be wondering why we're talking to Bill about poverty and intergenerational poverty. And this is a construction podcast. Well, there is a certain parallel there. I met Bill through this organization. I'm happy I did. And if you listen to what he has to say, whether you're an owner, an intern, or anybody in between, you can get involved and you can help solve this problem. Bill Simpson, welcome.
Oh, it's good to be here. I'm excited. And as you indicated, we've known each other a long time. I think we go back to 07, 08, 09 time frame.
Yeah, exactly. And in all transparency, Bill and a mutual friend, Pastor Dan Crow, introduced me to Bill, and I, we'll tell that story as we go. But Bill, give us some background on you personally. And I got to tell you, and I don't want to embarrass him by saying this, he is the most knowledgeable person I know about something nobody wants to talk about, and that's poverty.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I didn't set out to be this guy. In fact, technically, I'm in my 4th career. So by way of background, I'm a native Marylander, raised throughout the state. My father had been the vice president of a dairy in Western Maryland, and with 5 children in 1960, decided to go into the ministry. So that was a vow of poverty as far as I could tell. We moved all over and spent a lot of different pastorates in the state of Maryland. That kind of fed my early years. My first career out of college, I was an analyst for the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington. And
Naval Intelligence.
Naval Intelligence.
Just
no,
kidding.
not at all.
There's Navy people.
In fact, you'll notice that when the President of the United States wants an intelligence officer to brief the country, it's always a Navy guy. Okay. So we're very proud of that because the Navy has always been on the high seas at war. They're not in garrison sitting back and polishing planes and tanks. They're out on the high seas. But I was on my way to become a career intelligence analyst. I was a Soviet naval expert on submarines and the nuclear triad. And then supposedly peace broke out. And we all knew that the first President Bush was making a mistake. We knew the world had changed on January 20th, 1989, when we all got one of the original emails. And we were told, as of today, we will no longer refer to the Soviet Union as a threat nation. And we all looked at each other and thought, oh, this is different. And it was different. They started downsizing the Soviet side of the house. And I didn't want to do that. So I left and went off to graduate school, became a teaching fellow at the University of Maryland in the history department. From there, I ended up as a chief operating officer of a family services agency in suburban Baltimore and worked with treatment foster kids, which are technically abused or neglected children. And in 2002, Maryland elected Bob Ehrlich governor. And Bob Ehrlich came in and said, we're not going to continue what we're doing in foster care. Maryland law says that a foster child has to be reunified with their biological family or adopted within 2 years, and that doesn't happen for lots of reasons. That sent shockwaves through the whole foster care system in the state of Maryland. I ended up going out at the direction of my board chairwoman at the time on a monthly home visits, because about 80% of the foster kids in the state of Maryland come out of Baltimore City. And the biological reunification was very difficult in West and East Baltimore. The caseworkers that worked for me were sort of apoplectic. I'm not reunifying these kids. And a lot of our kids were 10 to 18 years old, so they're very hard to adopt. And while I'd been around Baltimore all my life, I grew up a Colt and Oriole fan, and
we won't hold that against you.
From the suburbs. But I was like a lot of suburbanites, if you went up Green Mountain, turned right on 33rd to Old Memorial Stadium, you eventually locked your doors. And that was my image of Baltimore growing up, was Memorial Stadium. With this opportunity, I got exposed to West and East Baltimore entrenched intergenerational poverty. And I realized that there's a third world nation right there in a city that I love. And one thing led to another, and put together some seed money, and we started a nonprofit to go attack American poverty.
which is what we're going to dive into. But you said intergenerational poverty.
Right.
And I was the guy, and I'm not happy to admit this, would be the guy to be driving my car, in the city of Baltimore and seeing people on the corners and saying, get a damn job.
Right. Of course.
Not that simple. So explain intergenerational poverty.
Well, what we've got now in this country through a whole series of unintended consequences. See, I don't think government is inherently evil or stupid. It isn't. I've worked with a lot of great government folks. But government does have a systemic defect, which is a lot of unintended consequences come out of public policy. What we've done at least since the Great Society in 65, but probably even predating that, is we have built a system where people can't get out of the system. But simultaneously with that, if you take the city of Baltimore, at the very same time, between 1970 and 1985, Baltimore, Maryland lost 100,000 jobs in manufacturing. So the neighborhoods that I eventually set up shop in, if you went back to 1970, these were the old Johnny Unitas Brooks Robinson neighborhoods. These were the clean marble steps. These were the neighborhoods that were a third African American, a third white ethnic, and a third longtime Baltimoreans. And they all lived together they worked well together because they could get in their cars and they could drive to Sparrows Point and they could work at Bethlehem Steel and they could work at General Motors. Well, all those jobs were gone by 85. I ended up working with the sons and grandsons of those workers who were still in the neighborhood, which was now drowning in poverty. So we systemically have built some bad government programs. We can talk about this at great length if you want to, but in 97 through welfare reform, we just threw a poison pill all over this issue, which we can't dig out of unless we have radical welfare reform in another direction. But we also started to build an economy where you were offshoring jobs. So like you take General Motors in Baltimore. Well, those jobs in 85 moved to a right-to-work state in the South, and then they eventually left the right-to-work state and they went to Mexico. So industry has been chasing low wages for a long time and leaving all these people in its wake. And what do? And so this set in motion poverty that gets passed down. So one of the things we've done successfully with a lot of our clients, and we work with clients at all different levels of intensity. That's part of our system. We don't work with everybody, and we can talk about that. We would do family tree studies. And lots of my family tree studies, in fact, one young man that you hired in the past, when I sat down with his mother and with him, it turns out that of the 50 men in that family tree, only one man had never been incarcerated.
Say that again, Bill.
In a family tree, and this was not unusual, but in this family tree of 50 African American men going back to the 1920s, only one had never been incarcerated. So this becomes part of the intergenerational passage, is that if dad's locked up and the streets are right out front down the marble steps, and now in 85, 86, 87, something else is happening in Baltimore, which is this thing called crack cocaine is coming down from New York City. If you're a sports fan and you remember the Len Bias death of, I think, 86, 87, well, the whole country is just going crazy over cocaine. So this is all happening in Baltimore. At the very time the good jobs are leaving and young men are coming out of school with nothing to do, the drug culture takes over. So all of this, plus other things that we haven't talked about yet, just collude to create what we now have, which are family systems in which, in large measure, a lot of the men don't know how to go to work, don't have job skills. And when we try to get them ready to go to work, we run into, too frequently, employers that aren't wired to understand them.
And that's why I think it's so important to have people like you who can connect the dots, which you did,
right.
and which is not easy.
No,
right?
It's incredibly difficult.
But before we get to how you operate, explain why the welfare situation in 1987,
97.
I'm sorry,
That's
1997 spoiled things.
Well, in fairness to Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, who were also doing a very evil deed with each other over their extramarital affairs at the time, they were leveraging each other while this legislation's being navigated. They were at the end of a continuum.
There.
Yeah, it's a true statement.
Okay.
And I challenge either one of them to call me and we'll have that discussion. Okay. I'm a historian by training.
Okay.
I've done the research. But they were at the end of a continuum of wanting to reform the welfare system. Every American president since Richard Nixon, the first president after Lyndon Johnson, has been trying to reform welfare. And Democrat and Republican, and they've all taken different slices at it and different stabs at it. By the time you get to 96, when the law was written and it gets implemented in July of 97, you now have a Congress that has been gearing up for 15, 20 years to really hack at public assistance. And there really wasn't much pushback on Capitol Hill except from the extremely far left. And they didn't hold up on this thing. So it's difficult to get your brain around it. But by 97, here's what we did with welfare for the first time in American history. So the very first public assistance in American history is something called Mother's Aid. Mother's Aid goes back to the 1910s and 1920s. It actually starts with the state of Illinois. It gets copied in other states. And in America's very first public assistance to poor families, here were the rules, the basic ground rules. It had to go to a non-divorced woman. It had to go to a woman who hadn't had children out of wedlock. It had to go to a white woman. It could not go to an immigrant white woman. It had to go to a native-born white woman. So this begins the original DNA of our public assistance. But it was still progress because other than some Civil War veterans benefits after the Civil War, we'd never done this because this had always been charity. This had always belonged to the religious crowd. But by the time you get to the 1910s, 1920s, religion's trying to get out of this. And so government's left to what do we do with these women? So they had these very tight classifications. The next step in the journey is 1938 Social Security Act. And what FDR did, which was genius, because they've been trying to pass this stuff before. I'm going to get back to Clinton and Gingrich here. But the timeline is interesting because we now most of us are very comfortable with Social Security. We value it. But at the time FDR got it run through Congress, it was a huge achievement. And what he did, what made it possible, was he made Social Security not a benefit program. He made it an insurance program. Because at the time he's pushing this through Congress, America is 25% unemployed, and 50 to 75% of them are white men. So this is you couldn't tell white men in 1935 and 37 and 38 you're going to go on charity. So we created a social insurance program. We've built that program, and that program really grows. It gets into all kinds of things. In the 1950s, it gets into disability. You get to 96, 97, and they're trying to, on the right, they're trying to blow all this up, and on the left, they're trying to hold on to it. So under the law of unintended consequences, we created a nightmare for poor people. So starting in 97, for the first time in American history, mothers of infants and toddlers had to go to work in order to receive any public assistance. That was not under Mother's Aid. That was not under FDR. So we're putting moms and children, we're separating them to go to work. Another, what I consider a poison pill inside the system, was that they took the number, which is the government has guidelines every year on what constitutes poverty. So like right now, for a family of four in the United States, I think you're considered poor if your household income is around $28,000, $27,000. Okay. And that formula has not been updated since 1963. And we can talk about that, why that is such an ugly story. But in 96, what they said was, okay, here's what we're going to do going forward. Your poverty threshold, let's say a family of four, poverty is $24,000. You're only eligible for public assistance up to 50% of your poverty threshold. So get your brain around that. That means the minute you make more than $12,000, you lose $1. Exactly. It disincentivizes everything. And it really hurts the very people that public assistance should be helping, which is children. So I contend, after 16 years in East Baltimore, having worked inside 900 impoverished households, having been up close to 300 ex-offenders, I contend that what we did through welfare reform is we put the drug game in cities like Baltimore on steroids. We created a new urban family system. I say to audiences all the time, they're poor, they're not stupid, which is part of the problem with poverty work, is that invariably people I want to go to help with the poor, they want to say, well, they're lazy or stupid. Actually, they're not lazy and they're not stupid.
I know on your website, you said people are trapped in the next moment, and that rings so true.
Yeah.
You know, they're so concerned about eating today,
Absolutely.
putting food on, food on the table with their family, that they're going to do whatever they got to do, right?
That's exactly where they live. It's hard to get your brain around that if you live any other American lifestyle. If you're lower middle class, upper middle class, rich, you just can't do it. But if you get on the streets of a city like Baltimore and you're around poor people, you start to realize how urgent their lives are every day. That they literally long-term planning is Saturday.
Right.
They can't lock in on developing or growing because they've got to feed their kids today. And going back to welfare reform, when you got to the 50% of the poverty threshold and you lowered the benefit to the family to begin with, the family starts turning to the drug dealer inside the system, inside the city, to feed their families. And so this is why drug dealing is omnipresent in Baltimore, and they're never going to fix it until they fix welfare. They're directly connected. Another poison pill inside this law was, for the first time in American history, this is the new block grant. Remember the block grant? The block grant's going to fix everything. One of the myths is that if you take government money and you get it to the lowest local level, you get the best outcome. Well, that's not true with this topic. But that's what we were doing. So what we did in 96 is we said, starting in 97, every governor of the 50 governors can withhold at the end of the year up to 20% of the total block grant that state received that year on all public assistance and welfare programs. And if you start running those numbers, you start to realize how much money that is. And you can then, Mr. Governor, use that off your budget for anything you want. You want to build schools, you want to build roads, you can take that. Before, all that money had to go through accountants and go back to the federal government at the end of the year.
So they spent it.
And here's how I discovered this, David. One snowy weekend, I had a caseworker come to me on a Friday and say, I'm not going to tell you why, but I'm going to give you 5 case files, and I want you to look at them over the weekend while you're watching football and watching the snow. And then we'll get back and we'll talk about it. And I saw in a couple hours what she was getting at. And basically, it was 5 young women, all essentially the same person. 25 to 30, African-American female, high school diploma or better, never been in trouble with the law, 1 or 2 children. And when they went to the Department of Social Services, they all got a dramatically different outcome. Some got bus fare, some didn't. Some got job training money, some didn't. Some got full food stamps, some got partial food stamps. And you sat there and you looked at this and you went, what is going on here?
Right.
So, came back, told you before I was a naval intelligence analyst. I said there's got to be an answer here. And I started digging with the state of Maryland. I started digging with Baltimore City. And what I discovered was, while the caseworker at Baltimore City DSS probably did not know what the law had changed to, the management was pressing them to play hardball with people looking for public assistance because the state was looking to recover that 20%.
Wow.
Okay?
Yeah, that's granular.
And that's still going on. Subsequent to that, I'll give you an example of how this law has been just crazy. In the state of Texas, all public assistance federal dollars is all spent on adoption. It's not spent on anything else. In the state of Florida, they've combined workforce development and poverty assistance. So now if you're looking for food stamps for your hungry child, you've got to first get in a workforce development project before you can qualify. And it all sounds good. It all makes sense until you actually meet the people and learn about their lives and realize I'm stealing. By the way, the current food stamp allotment in America, the high mark, is $1.80 a meal for 3 meals a day.
Yeah, that's not much.
So you want to talk about inner city obesity? It's because these moms need to get these kids in high calorie food, which is always the worst food.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here and say, and then we're going to take a short break, because you have laid out in my mind why there's such intergenerational poverty. You use Baltimore as an example.
That's what I know best.
And we're going to talk about you being on the streets in Baltimore after our break. But I will say that as a devil's advocate, I'm going to say, Bill, why should I care? Why should my tax money go toward what you're describing as almost failed programs? Now, before you answer that, right? There's a lot of good things that are done.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Lots of great churches and other charitable organizations. They all want to do something. There's thousands of them, literally.
That's right.
But there's no master plan.
There's no master plan, and there's no quarterback.
There's no quarterback.
No.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer this question before we break. Why should I care? Why should my tax dollars go to somebody I don't know in Baltimore?
Well, there's lots of reasons. At the start would be humanitarian gestures. We want to believe as Americans that we're better than this. Okay. But I can give you some concrete ones. First of all, there is a direct connection between the drug dealers that I've worked with in East Baltimore and the methadone opioid crisis in Western Ohio. Okay, so drug dealing is so profitable because of what we've done with welfare. It's energized drug dealing. So anywhere in America, you are affected by what some poor person in some poor neighborhood is doing. When I talk to drug dealers in East Baltimore, and I'll say to them, "You're killing your neighborhood," and they laugh. And they'll say, "No, I'm not. 90% of who I sell to are suburbanites coming in here." I went out one day with a drug dealer at his invitation and watched it for the first time. And at traffic lights, and you know Baltimore, it's a grid street system. Suburban SUVs come in, white guys jump out of the traffic light, typically white guys. There are some black drug addicts too. And they time it with the light. Out from the row houses pop the dealer, and on they go. And it happens in broad daylight. It happens so much that nobody sees it.
So what you're saying is, selfishly, that's one reason.
Absolutely.
Right?
If you want to
affecting me in my neighborhood.
If you want to get your child's high school parking lot safe from drug dealers, you've got to care about poor people.
Interesting way of looking at it. Give me another example.
The cost of mass incarceration. Give you an example. The last time I looked at this, about 5 years ago, the government combined was spending about $88 billion on mass incarceration, federal government. That same year, the federal government, through NIH and all of our government research labs, spent $6 billion total on all forms of cancer research.
This is crazy.
So you look at this stuff and you go, oh my God, is anybody paying attention to this? So when you spend $90 billion a year doing the same thing over and over, becoming the world's largest incarcerator of human beings, and then you break these people and they come flying out with no opportunity to ever get ahead.
I go back.
So if your car gets broken into in a suburban parking lot, if your child ends up accidentally becoming a heroin addict because somebody at a McMansion party in the suburbs offered him alcohol and then weed, and then they tried this, 9 times out of 10, that heroin, cocaine, fentanyl is coming from an inner city drug dealer. That's how it works.
So, Bill, you're saying humanitarian,
should
absolutely, and it should end there.
Should.
But it doesn't. So if it doesn't, you're talking about the safety of your own neighborhood.
Yeah, we're all in. Well, it comes down to this. Do you believe that we're all in this together? Or do you believe that America is perfectly fine becoming a nation of gated communities and expensive condos and everybody else outside?
Sure. The great inequality.
And I'm not anti-wealth. So I know that's always the pushback.
But see, wealth can be a really powerful tool.
Sure.
If it's used properly. So,
all right.
You learned a lot, and so did I, in that segment. We're going to take a quick break, and when we get back, we're going to talk about Bill's history walking the streets. You talked
Okay.
about it a little bit, but walking the streets in Baltimore and more about what Open Door does. Hey everybody, I'm Dave Presida, president of Adequate Construction Services LLC, and I would love to talk to you business owners about your business. I bet you most of you that are listening have at least 75% of your personal equity tied up in the business. If you care about options on how to get that money out, that's what I want to talk to you about, because I've been through it. I was a business owner and I sold my business. Didn't even know there was a buyer, but there are plenty of them. There has never been a better time than now to sell your business. So maybe you haven't even thought about it. The last deal I did, the guy, I talked to him, I said, "Do you ever consider selling your business?" He goes, "Didn't know I could." Well, yes, you can. There's a lot of options. I would urge you to go to my website, adicorp.com, adicorp.com, my last name spelled backwards, and go to Season 1 Podcast, Episode 2, Sales and Acquisitions. It's going to answer a lot of questions you might have. Yes, we talk about how you value your company, but that's only one piece, right? We're talking about why you would sell, who would buy it, common concerns about you, your staff, your clients, your legacy, all important things to discuss. So go and listen to that podcast and then contact me. Either call me or leave a message on my contact page on the website and I will get back to you, because as I said when I started, I look forward to talking to you about your business between now and then. Stay safe and stay tuned. Welcome back to Commercial Construction, Elevate the Industry. Again, we're happy to have Bill Simpson, CEO of Open Door America. And I got to tell you, we had some we had some very vibrant discussions when we were off air. And I want to get back to something we talked about, Bill. Okay. And I said that you said welfare was a failure, and you corrected me. Talk about that.
It's not a failure in one sense, it's a disaster. What welfare is still doing is it's tamping down what I think would be an insurrection if it wasn't in place. Because it is the last line for the very desperate in our civilization. It's the last line of defense. And honestly, last January 6th, when I turned on my TV, my first thought was, if you'd have asked me 10 years ago, who were the most likely Americans to storm the US Capitol and break walls and threaten Congress, it wouldn't have been a bunch of fat white men. It would have been inner city black people from Baltimore who'd had enough. I've always been charmed and blown away by the graciousness and humility of inner city poor people. It runs counterintuitive to everything everybody believes, but they don't have a sense of entitlement. They are not lazy. They need a break. They need help. But I used to say to my guys all the time, what keeps you from going out to the Columbia Mall and blowing people away? Because in America, it's always the angry white kid that's killing people in shopping centers. It's not the stereotype of what some want to believe. And invariably, every guy I've ever talked to said, "Why would I do that, Mr. Simpson? Why would I do that? Why would I harm somebody innocent?" Which gets to the 300 murders a year in Baltimore. They're all drug turf wars.
So I'm glad you cleared that up, and that's a big.
I know. I know. I'm probably just offended half your audience.
No, it's what you believe, and I respect that. So let's talk about you on the streets of Baltimore and Open Door America. How did it start, and where is it today?
Well, when I decided to start this thing, some of my family and professional contacts, because I was working at a religious, faith-based family service agency that had connections to a national denomination. And the national denomination wanted to do some work in Baltimore, but they really didn't know what they were going to do, and they didn't do anything well. And I don't want to name them. So, but I took some of their seed money, and for the first year, I just went out and did research. And I probably visited 25 anti-poverty operations across America. New York, Washington, Gary, Indiana, West Chicago, Dallas, New Orleans. I went everywhere. And I just would meet with people who were running successful poverty initiatives. And invariably, at the executive director level, they would all tell me the same thing. Phil, I don't know if you can do this, but if you can find a way to self-fund and not be dependent on a grant from a foundation or a government agency, you might be able to figure some of this out.
So you're saying you went to successful,
Oh,
and by successful you mean still in business,
very, very successful that way.
but funded by
They
the
were all
government or
they
other-
were all on the addiction of who funds you.
and you're not.
Yeah, with this comes a vow of poverty. You understand? You know,
Sure.
So we intentionally said we're going to try to do this on the lean. The other thing is I had a lot of prior experience managing people and projects, so I knew going in that I would rather have one great worker than 3 average workers. I didn't want the energy that lots of people caused. I was always looking for the star. So that was my model going in, how I wanted to manage this thing. I didn't need a big staff. I wanted a motivated staff. So we, in the very, very first 2 years, we ran a very successful after-school project in a community that's a stone's throw from Ravens Stadium, and a community that was part of the original Underground Railroad system in West Baltimore. A very proud African-American community. And that community was under great distress at the time because their government, not contract, but every public housing project in America is term limited. They're not supposed to be permanent. And this one was going to be up for discussion in a few years, and it was surrounded by gentrification. So this introduced me to, this is how poor people see government. Which is interesting because a lot of people think poor people are addicted to government. A lot of poor people really resent government. Okay, so we did this after school, and we won an award from the mayor in the first year. You mentioned Dan Crow earlier. Dan and I went out. We raised $90,000 in 30 days, and we ran a very successful after school in his congregation in suburban Baltimore, the church at Covenant Park. Committed, some weeks 50 volunteers, and would come in, and we ran the most incredible after-school program, mostly because of Dan and his church.
And that's what got you started?
That was our first 2 years. We were doing this, and then in the fall of the second year at our annual meeting, I went to my board and I said, I'm getting out of the after-school business because it's not where we need to be. And this is the nonprofit dilemma: is that if you become successful at something, you can fund it. But the funding then drives you to never see anything but what you're doing. And what we were seeing was, we were helping 90 kids, but they didn't want to go home.
Wow.
And it would get to be 6 o'clock and it was getting dark, and we had children crying with the volunteers saying, I don't want to go home. And you just sort of sit there and go, and Dan and I had journeyed that whole year. I said, Dan, I'm not going to keep doing this because there's lots of after school programs. And there were in Baltimore a lot of great ones. And I don't need to be taking that money. I don't want to be that guy. So he said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to work with the moms and dads. And so that's what we did. And so when I got to the annual meeting, I lost some board members and I lost some support because people love to help children. And what I got to was, and you know this because you loved it, our tagline for a number of years was the best children's program is a living wage job for mom and dad.
Because then the children want to go home.
Yeah, because if you are staunchly anti-government, if you are staunchly anti-charity, you still have to recognize we are drowning in impoverished children. On any given year, America's 30% of our children are living in poverty. It's a chronic problem. Some years it's 40%.
It's the worst.
It's the worst. It's embarrassing. So whatever your view is, the children are still poor and they're there. So we got to, how do we help mom and dad?
And Bill, that's got to separate you from a lot of programs. And again, programs are well-intentioned, but a program might feed a child for a day.
Right.
What about tomorrow?
Right. Well, at the time we walked away from after school, we not only lost some board members and support, we also lost money from this large denomination. They owed me another $300,000 of startup money, and we had $800 in checking that wasn't their money, and we still did it because I was bound. Because I took the attitude, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to figure this out.
Right.
I mean, everything we know is from some form of failure.
So we talked about poverty. We all know it's there. we talked about some reasons why people like me should care, right? We talked about welfare reform. You were in the city, you were 2 years in the after school program. What got you into the real nuts and bolts of helping people get jobs?
Well, what was going on in Baltimore at the time was one of the neighborhoods, a West Baltimore neighborhood, was the darling of everybody. Every foundation, every government office was trying to work in Park Heights. And Park Heights is this historic neighborhood that it's divided by a street called Northern Parkway, and on the west side of Northern Parkway is Pimlico Racetrack and the affluent Jewish population, and on the east side of it is the more impoverished African American. And the communities actually work well together. But Park Heights was all the way down to downtown, and it was getting all the attention and millions of dollars of support. And I was meeting with people in the mayor's office at the time and city council. By the way, for all of the bad press that Baltimore, Maryland gets, for all of the bad press, at the time I was doing this, everybody in that city government was a champion.
Right. I'm glad you said that.
It was. I could not get helped enough. When Martin O'Malley was mayor of Baltimore, if I called his office at 4:00 and said, I need 30 gallons of paint at a project tomorrow, it was there. Some young person in a coat and tie brought out paint. Yep. But it went beyond that. Everybody I work with, Councilman Jack Young, guys like that, they could not help me enough. They returned your calls. They were just outstanding public servants, which is distressing because of since Freddie Gray, Baltimore gets depicted one way, and there is a certain level of political scandal in the city.
Some of the issues they've had with mayors and so on.
Yeah,
but I'm glad you said that.
But it was a great city for that. And so in meeting with city staff, somebody nudged me and said, you know where we really need help is in this corridor in East Baltimore. And if you don't know Baltimore very well, if you kind of know where Johns Hopkins Hospital is, and a street called Orleans runs west to east in front of Hopkins, you eventually get to streets that run north up to a street called North Avenue. And Baltimore is essentially divided into 4 quadrants. Charles Street runs north to south and creates East and West Baltimore. North Avenue runs west to east and creates North and South Baltimore. So there's a section of East Baltimore, east of Hopkins Hospital, on the way to North Avenue, that is just devastated by the drug war and by poverty. I once took a prospective board member from Montgomery County, Maryland, to see this neighborhood, and this very accomplished man breaks into tears, an older man, and he says, "This looks like pictures of Berlin in 1945. Mm-hmm. And I said, "This is America. This is America. This is what we've done."
Baltimore.
Oh, it's everywhere. See, I love Baltimore, and I hate it when Baltimore gets brushed as this is the worst place in America. Oh my God, in so many ways, it's such a better city than other places that are ignoring. Baltimore's trying to fix these problems. I mean, I'm a big champion for the city.
So tell me how Open Door, person by person, is helping fix this problem.
All right. So we moved into that neighborhood, and then 4 years later, we got braver and we went further into the belly of the beast. And we were the very first building. We're working in a 12-foot wide row house, 4 floors. The bottom floor you couldn't use because the rats owned it. I actually had a pastor named Mike Watterson from suburban Baltimore who once a week came into my office and captured the live rats and picked up the carcasses and considered this his New Testament ministry to the poor. Mm. He did this every week for years. Guy could have done anything in our organization, but this is what he wanted. He said, "This is what God wants me to do." So that's the kind of thing these kinds of operations attract. During those years, this would be 2007 to like 2012, 2013, we were literally seeing 25 new cases every day. And I've described it as, it was like a fire hydrant, broken humanity flying in our front door. I do have a funny story about our front door. Can I tell it?
Sure.
So
funny.
You're always trying to network. It's what you're doing when you're in these neighborhoods. And let's be honest, I'm a white guy, and I was working in a neighborhood that was 99% African American, and I had an extra burden to build trust. And so the only way you can do that is put on your dirty tennis shoes and get out and hit the streets. And we did that every day. And I met a guy who was the most charming, aging, poor guy you would ever want to know. And his kids were turning out great. I knew he had a good heart, but he never made a dime. And so one Friday I called him into my office and I said, look, he said, I don't have a lot of money, but I've got some paint. One of the paint stores had donated some paint. I said, it was white paint. I said, would you paint our front door this weekend? And I'll give you $50. Because he told me it'd take him about 2 hours. I said, I'll give you $25 an hour, $50. Got back in on Monday morning, and our row house door was the brightest canary yellow you have ever seen.
That is funny.
And what he had done is, he had that from another job, and he took that other paint and made money in an entrepreneurial way. These were really smart folks.
Right.
So I said, his name was Cornette. I said, Cornette, the yellow door. I said, he said, well, here's the thing, man. He said, that other money, paint, I can make some money with it for my family. Well, I can't argue with that. Mm-hmm. That yellow door became our calling card. Mm-hmm. And all through the neighborhood, everybody knew us as the good people behind the yellow door.
Awesome.
It's a crazy story, but we were there, and we were seeing, like I said, on average, 25 new cases a day.
So what is your prototype client?
Well, there wasn't one. So this is what happens. So we were seeing, at that time I had 1.5 full-time caseworkers, and I had some retired clinical social workers that volunteered a lot of hours. So we would typically have 3 or 4 caseworkers in building and then support staff. And we would open the doors at 8:30 in the morning, and the line just would come. And it was everything. I just got out of jail last night. I don't know what to do. And I want to talk about what happens when people come out of jail. My husband or boyfriend is beating me and the children. I'm being evicted this week. I can't afford to turn on my electric. It eventually turned into things like my 8th grade daughter has an algebra test on Friday. I need somebody to tutor her because I can't do it. It was everything.
Right.
So what you end up doing is you just start to get real savvy on something called information referral. And you try to build a network of people in the city, in private and public services that you know you can trust when you send them to them. And this is where I became a fan of Catholic Charities. Because I believe Baltimore City would fall into the ocean if Catholic Charities did not exist. Mm-hmm. They do the most amazing work in that city. But we would see everything. What we eventually got to was, and it was a Baltimore City judge that got me there, we eventually shifted our orientation away from teens and young adults. Because that's what you're led to believe were the answers, right? Because you're taught in all the nonprofit seminars and all the educational meetings that education's the key.
And once they hit a certain age, right?
And it is the key if you're wired to receive the education. I know I'm chasing rabbits here, but I had a couple people come to me and say, we will fund you to do a GED program. I said, great. But I'm an analyst. So I said, I'm going to dig into GED. How does GED work? I went to the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., and I met with somebody, and then that just tripped me up. What I learned was that if you're in a GED program and you're under the age of 25, your success rate is better. But if you're 25 and older, which is where my clients were, at that time, this would be like 2010, the national GED numbers were a 99% failure rate. 0.8% of adults 25 and older who started GED in the preceding years actually completed it. I eventually got to where I would say to employers, if you can choose between hiring somebody with a master's degree or a GED, hire the GED. I promise you they worked harder to earn that GED. It is incredibly difficult to earn a GED once you've been pushed out of school. It's really hard. And most of the people that are listening to this podcast could not pass the GED test.
So I just learned something there. I'm not going to take the GED.
No, it's really hard.
So you went from everything.
We started narrowing, focusing.
Right.
Where can we make, because again, we're raising our own money. And we had a lot of pressure points on us. Do this, do that, do this. GED was one of those pressure points. And I realized there were already GED programs. And that became sort of our mantra too. We're not going to reinvent something that already exists. If we find somebody doing something well, we're going to link arms with them. And we're going to support them and endorse them. You will never hear Open Door ever criticize anybody who's even trying to make a difference. Yeah. Even if I can find ways that I would do it better or differently, they are all worthy of our appreciation.
The right spirit.
Absolutely, because that's where it starts. So one morning in a Baltimore City courthouse, there's 8 courthouses on North Avenue. They're all the same courthouse. And I would go at least 2 times a week for several years to support my young clients who were facing the judge. And I don't know if you've ever been in a Baltimore City courthouse, but they're all kind of interesting and they're the same. So you walk in, and on the right wall is the equivalent of church pews all the way up to the wall. And they sit, and they eventually get to the state's attorney or the public defender. They go to the state's attorney first. And if they cut some kind of a deal right there, they go across to the other wall, to the other church pews, and the public defender, in many cases for the first time, as they're going to see the judge. This is the first time they've talked to an attorney. Mm-hmm. They get 5 minutes of legal. And what you see there is, this is where the plea bargain system really kicks into high gear, which ruins lives. So I'm in court a lot. I'm just there to try to support. And a judge on the Baltimore City bench calls me up to the bench and says, "Who are you? You're in here all the time." And I did stand out because I was like one of the few white men in this courthouse. And she said, "Who are you?" And she said, "Are you a social worker?" I said, "No." And she said, "Are you an attorney?" I said, "No." She said, "Are you clergy?" I said, "Oh, heck no." I think I said, "Hell no." And she laughed and she said, "I want to talk to you because you're here." So we talked. And what she told me was, she said, "When you look at your clients' arrest records, what do you see?" I said, "Well, it's really striking you're asking me that." I said, the printouts go like this. And you look, these guys have been arrested 5, 10, 25 times, but they're never in jail for more than 2 years. She said, "Let me tell you what you're seeing. And this is what you need to do with your program." She said, "Do you know what 5 years in a day means?" And I said, "I've never heard that." She said, "Every day, Baltimore City judges, Maryland judges, and federal judges get the same, every week they get the same message from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which is, stop sending people away for long sentences beyond 5 years in a day if you can avoid it. Because under federal law, and it's federal money that feeds the state prisons and the Baltimore City Detention Center, if you have 5 years plus 1 day, you have to serve 5 years. And if you have a 5-year sentence, you have to get GED, social services, job training. And the system doesn't provide that. I mean, they can't. They're drowning because the jails are filled with marijuana charges. This is what we've done, okay? You know, only about 3 to 4% of people incarcerated in America are incarcerated for violent crimes. It's everything else. So this judge said, "You know, Bill, you're off to a start." And she said, "I like where you are." She said, "I'm going to give you the tip. Start trying to only work with young adults who know they are they're 1 arrest away from 5 years in a day."
Bullet point 1.
Yeah. And I said, "Oh my God." I took it back to Dan. It made sense to Dan. Now, here's the trap door. I'm working in a community that has a very government mindset. And I wasn't a government agency. And in the journey, this taught me some things that I didn't expect to learn. So she said, "You're going to find that your ideal candidate is 28 to 40 years old, which is a lot older than what everybody had told me. Because everybody said, you got to work with the youth. You got to work with the young. You got to fix the future." What she said is, until we've got them 1 arrest away from 5 years in a day, we still don't have their attention. But she said, the guys that you're going to run into that know they're 5 years in a day, they don't want to go back. And now you've got their attention. And she said, if you bring them to me, I can work with you with them. And we can leverage, because in Baltimore, going to the Baltimore City Detention Center for a lot of my guys is a little bit like suburbanites going to a high school reunion. It isn't that big of a deal. If you said I had to spend the night in Baltimore City jail tonight, I would just go jump out of a window. But for these guys to grow up with this, it's not good, but they know how to cope with it.
So did you adopt that as one of your criteria?
We did. In fact, we reoriented the whole organization. And the reason I could do that was I was self-funding. So
do whatever you want.
So I could go to my board and say, I know the last 6 months we've been talking about this, but I want to tweak the angle one more time. I've always had great support from people. They're like, and basically said, well, you're the nut that's down there. Our job is to support you.
It's hard to argue with that, Bill.
And they were very good with
both the nut and the fact.
No, absolutely. They were always like, in fact, for a long time, I tried to have our board meetings in the neighborhood, but they wouldn't do it after dark, and I understood. I completely understood. But we did. We reoriented, and we started doing that.
So one more time, you go to the big house. What about kids?
Well, that was the other piece of this, is that we knew, and the practitioners across the country had already informed me about this years earlier, and we saw it with our own eyes. When you're working with folks who have low education achievement, low job skills as commonly understood, and have a criminal record, and to be blunt, have black skin. Because on my best day, when I would send some of the most wonderful young men out, I knew they were running into race. I mean, I just knew it. And when I figured it out, I would confront employers about it. So all the odds are stacked against these young folks. What we started to see was, though, that if they had a child, it didn't have to even be in their house, but if they had paternal rights to a child, the child was the key. Because these men, who could be some of the strongest, toughest men in the world, would tear up every time they talked about their kid.
Yep.
Every time. It was just natural. Because they didn't want to be that dad.
Right.
So,
and they didn't want that kid to be that.
So the kid became the softener in the laundry. It's how our mostly female staff, and I had one retired grandmother, social worker in particular, Pat Muller. I got to say her name. She's gone now. But Pat knew how to work this game. And she would sit across the table one-on-one with these guys, and she would talk their stories, and she would say, you can be a better dad than that. And if you don't become a better dad, your child is headed for the same life. And it worked. And then we leveraged that with the one arrest away from 5 years and a day. What I was getting ready to say about the detention center was, on the streets of Baltimore, the place they don't want to go, which is where you go if you get a 5+1, is you go to Jessup, Maryland prison. And on Baltimore streets, Jessup is referred to as the cut. Because if you go to Jessup, you're going to get cut. And everybody knows it. I mean, literally gangster guys knew, I don't want to go to Jessup.
So you found the sweet spot, and that's probably a bad way to term it, but you found your wheelhouse in terms of the client, right? And so you have 100 people you can deal with. You whittled it down to 15.
That's right.
Okay. You train them. What's next? What happens next? Because
so,
I'm going to get to how we.
Okay. Well, this is all part of that journey, because by the time we meet, we've done this.
Right.
So, in all of our academic research and building relationships, and this is not meant to be condemning or arrogant, but the fact of the matter is, for all of the money we spend on poverty, nobody really knows what to do with it. I mean, there are answers, but especially the government offices. And here's why. Because government has a mandate to do what I call y'all come services. Whatever walks in the door, they got to help. What we started to see was 20-25% of what walks in is ready to change their lives. And 70-75% is gaming. And they're coming to get an unemployment letter signed off on, or whatever. They're just not ready.
They're not ready.
It's not that they're morally corrupt or awful people. It's just living the lives they do.
They're not ready.
And my guys, who weren't even gang dealers in most cases, were averaging $2,000 a day of revenue, 7 days a week. Well, that's tough money to leave for $9 an hour to flip burgers at McDonald's, which is why the 5 in a day,
that's a big deal.
And the child, with Pat sitting across the table, bringing them to tears, we were moving the needle, trying to get these folks. We weren't successful a lot, but about 20% of the time, we found the right guys. It got to the place when we were doing Saturday morning orientations in our North Milton Avenue office. By that point, we'd moved into a nonprofit building, a Weinberg building. A beloved political figure in East Baltimore who's now gone, a Maryland delegate named Hattie Harrison, who I befriended, and she befriended me more correctly, took an interest in me, and she said, you need to get out of that row house and I'm going to get you in that building. And she did, because she knew she had all the power. And we were in that building at the time, and we had better spaces. And so we were doing orientations, about 40 Saturdays a year. And I got to the place where it became standard. I would walk to the front of the room, and there was a big whiteboard. And I would write, "My name is Bill Simpson. I am not your Uncle Sam." And you could hear the groans and just everything. What I had learned is that in that group of 20, on average, 2 of them were going to come into my program. Two were ready. Another 2 to 5 were eventually going to come back. But the rest of them were just gaming me for whatever the reason. They were trying to please their grandmother. They were trying to please their pastor. They were trying to get somebody off their back. Whatever it was. By the way, in all those orientations, I never even put out a flyer. We were so ground truth in that neighborhood, it was all word of mouth. It was all word of mouth. They all knew. If they didn't know exactly what it is we did, they all knew we were good people. I was surrounded at Open Door, the best human beings you will ever meet. Just amazing volunteers and board members and staff who put their lives on the line every day in the craziest way, but they were so bought in. So they knew that was our rep. What happened during that time frame is we were once a month, we were going out to Dan Crow's Suburban Church, and we were doing an offsite day. We did this for a year. And we wanted to build our own model. We wanted to build something that we could use as a tool. We knew we would have to keep tweaking it. We eventually built something called the Individual Life Plan.
And on that note, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the Individual Life Plan and some other things. And I'm going to, kind of review how we met and how we work together. But the most important thing is, as an employer or even an employee, how you might be able to help. So we'll see you in a minute. Hey, welcome back to Commercial Construction, Elevate the Industry. Dave Presida here, our esteemed guest, Bill Simpson, CEO of Open Door America. And we've covered a lot so far, but I want to get specific about construction. Okay. And I know you have some figures you want to go over, but we met through construction, right? Met. Dan Crow came over to my office one day when I was in Columbia. I was with Component Assembly Systems. They're a great company, great people.
Yep.
And they gave me the latitude to work with you. And Dan came and showed me a picture of about 15 young men and a woman, I believe, who had just graduated from an ABC construction course.
Right.
They spent how many Saturdays, Bill?
It was a 10-week summer program at Murrayville High School in East Baltimore.
So this is a mind blower. I look at this and I say, that's awesome. You guys taught these people. And they gave up their Saturdays and did it, and you paid for it. That's awesome. And I asked him, I said, Dan, how many people are working? And you know what he said? Zero. And I can remember like it was yesterday. I said, you gotta be kidding me.
Yeah, they did everything. They did all the, ABC's got the curriculum out of Florida State. They got core curriculum 1, they got core curriculum 2, they got
everything.
OSHA training.
And these kids wanted a job.
Oh, absolutely.
So it was an easy step for me because we had a job. We were required by law to engage minority business enterprises and local hires.
Right.
So it made a lot of sense for me as an employer because you could refer me your clients, right? Who you've already screened. You've got these guys. Now we had to get over some of the things, right? Like priors,
sure. Right?
Like a marijuana charge or whatever. But we did. And we hired some people, and they were some of the best employees that we ever had. And occasionally we had a problem. I didn't have to call them. My superintendent, my foreman didn't have to call them. They called you.
That's exactly what happened.
So explain how that works.
Well, it gets to where all the solutions are. The solutions are not in policy. They're not in research. All the solutions that we're looking for are interpersonal. It's all about building trust and relationships. And that's what you and I did. And that's what I did with my clients. These were young men who had been in trouble with the law, whose dads had been in trouble with the law. But we'd gotten to them before they became lifelong wards of the state. And they wanted to change their lives. And what you're describing is a 90-acre redevelopment strategy connected to Johns Hopkins Hospital, where they leveled housing, and they had to do what they did. and they built high rises for nurses, but they did a lot of good in the community too. And so there was a lot of jobs at the time. At that time, we were already working with a company called TRF Development out of Philadelphia, and they were hiring our guys. And I think that's how you heard about us. They were doing great work until they lost their historic tax credits, which was another bitter pill that you just learn all this stuff. But you had, under set aside, I think the number was, when you added up all the different ethnic set asides and what was then known as local hire, I think it added up to 32 or 35% of the workforce was supposed to be from that geographical area. And nobody was hitting that.
Nobody was hitting it, and you had to go through hoops to get past the contracts and get paid. There were all kinds of forms you had to fill out. Well, I posted jobs, I did this, I did that. It was window dressing for a lot of people, and it was an administrative task to get beyond that. But you go back to the humanitarian part, right, and the part that matters is that you're getting good people. Let's face it, construction. It's not rocket science. You don't need a specific curriculum. No. You need to be an able-bodied person who's willing to learn. That's right. And you can learn almost everything in construction quickly and become an asset. But your people needed, as you say, mom and dad, a living wage job. Yeah. Right? Right. And I think that's what a lot of people miss. And you talk about, let's talk about the cost of losing employees. What is your estimate of a cost to lose?
The current best research on human resources management will tell you that every lost worker in America, and it's going to average out differently, construction versus IT, but across the country in all 50 states, in all industries, the experts will tell you it costs about 33% of that worker's annual salary to replace them. And the way they calculate that is they calculate the diminished production before they leave. They calculate something called morale disease, where they infect other workers with their bad attitudes. Then you've got the vacancy. Then you got to hire. Then you got to bring on board. Then you got to do whatever training you do. And then if it doesn't work out, you're repeating that cycle. So if you're hiring a $20 an hour worker, that 33% is going to mean you're going to spend about $14,000 to replace that worker. So it's a hidden cost. And if you're not savvy, you get lost on how hidden it is.
And if you're
but it's a reality.
Employee strong and you lose how many percent?
Well, this is where the worlds collide. So any savvy business owner knows nationwide the job churn rate is 66% of workers fail in the first 6 months.
See, that's incredible. Now, and this company will remain nameless. You and I tried to get into a company that had 5,000 employees, and no one there understood the cost of the cost of losing employees, and that company lost 40 to 45%.
Yes,
every single year.
That company, by their own testimony, was spending $30 million a year replacing the same 3,000 workers. And they did that year after year. And when I pressed them about why they would not go forward with the 3 pilot projects that we built for them, because I did what they wanted. I built a pilot project in Maryland, Florida, and Colorado, 30 workers each. When we got to the moment of truth, they backed out. Their explanation was, well, our stock went public, and we're a $5 billion company now. Their management did not understand, their board did not understand what management was doing. So I'm $30 million a year.
I'm going to go back to something that we said, the drug dealers, right? People get trapped in the moment out of need. And I'm going to say the same thing happens in business.
Oh, absolutely.
Because people, especially public companies, are looking at today's results. And investing in tomorrow is not always number one priority. And people in business just want to get things done. I see Open Door America and you as a way to bridge the gap. We have, in my opinion, one of the answers is to engage private business with people who need jobs. Right? Private business needs workers.
It is the answer.
People in cities like Baltimore, anywhere you go, need to work because a living wage changes things.
Absolutely. It changes everything.
Have you had much success with that?
Well, here's how I answer that question. When I've had an employer pay a fair wage and work with me, over 80% of our people have had successful jobs. But if I develop a client and I do all of my work and I send them out to a company that will terminate them on day 3 because their bus was late getting across from West to East Baltimore and they were 15 minutes late, and these are real stories that happen. And these are people I've worked with for 6 months to get them ready for that job. When you have that kind of company, I'm not taking ownership of that failure. That's their failure. Because they don't understand that's a human being they're letting go. They don't understand. And this is really the big problem right now in America, is how business doesn't understand disadvantaged entry-level workers, which makes up a huge swath of the American workforce. In America today, for example, 32% of adults have a criminal record.
Did not know that.
It's a huge number.
Anywhere near that.
It's a huge number. And 75% of people that have been released from prison are still unemployed 12 months after they leave jail, because we have a bias about we're not going to hire ex-offenders. Well, as the marketplace keeps changing, and by the way, the labor participation rate, which is the big bowl that all of this is in, if you go back to 2001 through 2021, U.S. labor participation rate has fallen 5%, meaning today only 61% of people 16 to 64 who could theoretically be in the workforce are actually seeking or employed. So the pool keeps getting smaller to begin with. Then you throw in job churn, which is averaging 18% a year. Then you throw in 66% failure in the first 6 months. Then you throw in 32% of Americans have a criminal record. Then you get to where, I'm not a fan of blaming COVID for everything, but where COVID really steps up for us is COVID revealed something I knew, which it finally made the news, which is 40% of American households don't have $400 to their name. That became a COVID data point.
Yeah.
And that's because we have built this chronic low-wage workforce. And yet it's the very entry-level job that can solve the poverty problem. And so I say to audiences all the time, I don't bash government, and I don't unlike charity, they're holding down the fort. They're tamping down the revolution.
The insurrection,
they are,
as you said earlier.
But the answer is get a job. The problem is when you say that as a successful person with your car doors locked, or you're driving through an inner city neighborhood, get a job, you're missing everything that's happening.
And I was.
You're missing the story. That person wants a job. But you know what they're not going to do? They're not going to work for $9 an hour for an international hamburger company who last year had profits in the United States of $20 billion. Right. They're not going to do it.
Right.
They're that smart. And I really believe that part of the poverty issue is too many Americans think poor people are stupid. They're not. They're very alert to what's going on.
So I got to tell you, this has been eye-opening. And we're going to have you back.
Okay.
We're going to dig into some of these things. We talked about so much today. My message to you, our listeners, is there is a way you can engage the right people for the right reasons and get the right results, and for not just for you, but for them too.
Right.
So I start with the humanitarian piece that you talked about, but there's a business piece behind this. There is a way that you can engage Bill and Open Door America. So why don't you let the folks know how to get a hold of you?
Well, the best way is to dial me directly. Did I give my number?
Absolutely.
Dial me at 571-465-0786. My email address is bsimpson, Simpson, at opendooramerica.org. And if you want to write to us, you can write to Post Office Box 2090, Ellicott City, Maryland, 21041.
And I got to tell you, it's changed me. There's a reason why we're still doing business together, and I'm happy about that. And there's going to be another chapter. So feel free, and I would urge you strongly to get a hold of Bill. Whether you're an employer or you're an employee, there's dozens of ways to make a difference, and you can. Now, as far as I'm concerned, you can follow us on Twitter at Elevate Industry. You can look me up on LinkedIn, David Procida. Just connect and check out my website. And there's a contact page on the website. It's adicorp.com, ADICORP.com. It's my last name spelled backwards. And it works.
Sure.
Anyway, so I can remember it anyway. There's a contact page there, and feel free to write about this episode or any episode, your thoughts, or even things you'd like us to talk about, guests you'd like us to have. We would encourage that strongly. And again, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. There will be chapter 2.
All right.
And again, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. It's great to be with you guys today. Thank you.
So stay safe and stay tuned. We'll see you next time. So follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Elevate Industry. Check out my YouTube channel at Commercial Construction, Elevate the Industry. Visit my website, adicorp.com, ADICORP.com. Go to LinkedIn, search for David Procida, hit connect, and follow me. Please rate, review, and comment on this episode, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Elevate. Elevate. Elevate.